Teleportation will commence in 5 minutes. Attention, do not leave any luggage unattended. Unattended luggage will be removed and destroyed. Attention, ladies and gentlemen. This is an announcement from Planet X31. Please take your seats.
Greetings, planet Earth, and welcome to the Science and Cocktails. Science and Cocktails is an initiative taken in cooperation with the Niels Bohr Institute, and its purpose is to bring first-class scientific information directly to you, Earthlings, without interference of any other sort, type of intermediate meeting. Its aim is to make the flow of thoughts and the flow of sensorial perception as smooth as the flow of a cocktail mixture. Tonight's teleportation will be guided by Beier, head of the Ecosystems Program at the Biosystems Department of HISO National Laboratory and leader of the Research Center Climate. His talk tonight will be about the biological time machine that him himself and his colleagues from all different parts of the world have built in order to test the different factors that can affect the development of ecosystems. They have built the second largest climate change experiment in the world that is only beaten by the largest experiment in the world that we are all part of. He will explain how this weird biological time machine works and what we can learn from it.
Ladies and gentlemen, after the words of Klaus Beier, we will have a performance by Eki, an improvising circle of female vocalists from Denmark, Norway, Finland, and Iceland, bound together by a love for intuitive music making. Each concert is a universe of its own, inspired by the present surroundings and moods.
Transmission.
Good evening. It's really a pleasure to be here. Next to getting the Nobel Prize, which of course would be the biggest, science and cocktails is the next biggest you can achieve as a scientist. I will tell you a little bit about the biological time machine that we have invented at the DTU and what we can learn from it. And I normally announce myself as a manipulator. So maybe you could be scared tonight that I will manipulate you, but I'm actually much better at manipulating ecosystems than manipulating people. But building a big time machine, biological time machine, of course, takes a lot more effort than I can do myself. So I've had a lot of friends from DTU, from Copenhagen University and Aarhus University, and people from all over the world that has contributed to the talk I'm going to give you. So what is a biological time machine, or what is a time machine? Well, some of you will know that this is a time machine. And some of you will even know where it comes from. I'll come back to this a little bit later. And if we take some biology and put into it, of course, by definition, this is now a biological time machine. It will be a little bit different from the one I'm going to show you. And here you see some other time machines. So there are a lot of perceptions of what a time machine is. I will not only tell you about the time machine, the biological time machine we have been inventing, but also tell you a little bit about climate change, because we didn't invent this time machine just for the sake of making a time machine, but because we have some important questions to answer, which has to do with climate change. But before I tell you that, I'm sorry, but you are now involved in what the politicians would call a heldagsskole, so a full day school. So you'll now be taught a short lecture on photosynthesis, because photosynthesis is where it all starts, and it's also part of the solution to the climate change problem. So what is photosynthesis? We have a plant, we have the sun who is providing energy, which makes the plant grow. When the plant is growing, it is accumulating or absorbing CO2 from the atmosphere. And that CO2, the carbon from that CO2, ends up in the plant. You can now see that there is less CO2 in the atmosphere because the plant took up some of it. But in the autumn, when the sun is getting lower, the plant starts to wilt, the leaves fall to the ground, and it starts to decompose. So part of that CO2, or all of that CO2, depending on some of the processes, will end up back in the atmosphere. So through the cycle of this plant, over a whole season, we are back to where we started. We are in some kind of equilibrium. That was the way the globe worked until human beings came and started to take out some of that biomass and started to burn it. And the more clever they get in burning the biomass, in order to get energy, if you look at the globe out from space, you can see how much biomass we're actually burning, or how much carbon we are burning, in order to create all this light. So we are so the plants or the ecosystems are accumulating CO2. But we can store carbon and we can harvest carbon. And it works like this. So the photosynthesis takes up the CO2 and it is released back into the atmosphere, and it's taken up again and released back in the atmosphere. And some of the CO2 that doesn't get decomposed ends up in the soil and it's gone. It's just like putting money into the bank. But you also saw that CO2 eventually came from the atmosphere. So now we have less CO2 in the atmosphere because some of it has been stored in the ground. When we take out the biomass and start to burn it, that CO2 is taken out of it's like taking money out of the bank. So we burn the carbon which has been stored for a very long time. It's no longer biomass. Well, it's also biomass, but it's also oil and coal which originally came from photosynthesis and which has been stored in the ground for billions of years, which we now take out of the bank and put back up into the atmosphere. And you can now see there's a lot more CO2 in the atmosphere than there used to be. That is exactly what climate change is about, and also part of why we were doing this biological time machine. So this is a globe. The sun is shining, and it provides a lot of energy to the globe, and some of it is sent back into the atmosphere. Fortunately, we have something we call the greenhouse effect. We have an atmosphere, so some of the energy which is accumulated by the globe doesn't get back into the atmosphere because it's trapped by get back into the space because it's trapped by the atmosphere, which actually heats the globe a little bit. Well, not a little bit. If it wasn't there, it would be about 30 degrees colder on Earth, and we probably wouldn't be here. So some people say, well, I don't believe in the greenhouse effect. That's a really dumb statement, because then you wouldn't be here. So the question is not so much about the greenhouse effect. That's for real. The question is how strong it is. So what happens now is that we are increasing the greenhouse effect because we take out that oil and coal which has been stored in the bank or on the ground for billions of years. So we pump extra CO2 into the atmosphere. So we are thickening the glass in our greenhouse, and therefore we are trapping more energy. That means that in the future, the globe will get warmer. So the future, as you can see here, means that we'll have more CO2 in the atmosphere. That will lead to a higher temperature because some of the energy gets trapped, or more energy gets trapped. And if you are increasing the temperature, you will alter the precipitation. You don't get more water, you don't get less water, but you get a different way it's coming. So what happens in the future if we are changing the climate? We have this ecosystem which consists of plants, and if you're a scientist, it consists of photosynthesis and biomass and plant chemistry and lithophile and a lot of other things. But if you're just walking in the heathland, you'll just see the plants. And when you have climate change working over time, it means that these factors, so elevated CO2, elevated temperature and water, will provide new conditions for the plants. So that means that the system, the ecosystem, or the plant we had when we started, will probably be different. So as time goes by, we'll have new conditions, meaning that we'll have new plants, we'll have potentially new production. That means that our agricultural plant production will be different. And we want to know how much and how will it be different. That is why we want to create a time machine. So we want to go time traveling in order to know and understand what is going to happen. There could be several reasons why you would do time traveling. And I'm a biologist or an ecosystem scientist, so I want to go time traveling to understand, but other people wanted to do it for other reasons. And this is where my time machine came from. So many of you know Calvin and Hobbes, and Calvin in this tune has got the assignment at school that he has to create, and of course when he gets to around bedtime and his mom asks him, he realizes that he didn't do his homework. And he gets this wonderful idea that he wants to make a time machine. Hobbes is a little bit speculative whether this will work, but Calvin is sure that if he travels 2 hours into the future, he will realize that his homework was done and he can take it home back and he'll be fine. So they do this time traveling, and of course it doesn't go quite like he wanted, because the Calvin 830 hadn't done it because he thought the Calvin 630 had done it. So they end up with a big fight about who was actually responsible for doing the homework. So the lesson from that is that it may not be easy to solve the problems simply by doing time traveling. So there is an alternative, which is what we have tried to do with our time machine. So we didn't time travel to solve the problem, but rather to understand it, and maybe through that be able to come with some guidance as to what could be done. So when you want to design a time machine, you have to go through several steps. So there are some design issues. The first step you could do or ask yourself is, how will I do the time travel? And then, of course, the second one could be what to look for. But let's start with step number one. I'll just give you two examples of how you can do time traveling. So either you can replace time with space, or you can create the future. We'll do the first one first. So we replace time with space. So if climate is going to change, the climatic conditions in Denmark is going to be a little bit like it is in the northwest France or the southern part of UK. Somebody understood that climate change may not be all that bad. So it'll be like northern France. So instead of waiting 100 years, why not go or make an experiment? Why not go to northwest France? Could have some benefits as a scientist, at least, to go there anyway. So that would be one chance. So it has some advantages. It's easy. It's not very costly. I mean, it costs like a flight ticket to get there and look for the things you want to look for. And you will also know that the Northwest France has had the conditions for a very long time. So the system is probably adapted very well to the conditions they have. So it's probably going to be a very good image of how Denmark is going to be. The second, but of course there's some disadvantages as well. Not everything will be the same. So how will you know, if you see a difference, how will you know that this difference was caused simply by the climate difference? It could be that the soil is different, the way people were treating the ecosystems were different, etc. So not everything will be the same, so the comparability may be a little bit difficult. And then of course, it is difficult to travel CO2-wise. By that I mean that I can travel temperature-wise. So if I know that temperature is going to be 3 degrees warmer, I can find a place which is 3 degrees warmer. If I know that precipitation will be only half of what it is today, I could find a place which has that precipitation. But it's not easy to find a place which has 50% more CO2 in the atmosphere, because CO2 is globally distributed. So CO2 is the same all over. There are a few places near some volcanic vents where you can be lucky to find elevated CO2, but otherwise it's a little bit difficult to know this CO2 story. So the time travel replacing space by time by space is not that easy. It's a good idea, and some are doing it, and you can get some good ideas from it, but it doesn't give you all the answers. So the second option is to create the future or make an experiment. And you can see here a number of different time machines, which I'll come back to a little bit later. The second question was, what are we going to look for? Well, if you're a scientist, you might look into very many different details, and some scientists might only look into one detail. But if you want to know something about the ecosystem, you need to know a lot about many different processes. And this is also indicating that if you, for example, if you turn on the heat, it doesn't mean that everything will change immediately. So it may take some time before the plants have grown a little bit more to get a little bit more biomass, meaning that it will take years before you'll have more biomass falling to the ground when these plants are going to die. So there we call it a cascade. So it will take some time. Some things will be, the photosynthesis, for example, that will react instantaneously if you change the CO2. While, for example, the microbial community in the soil, it might take a couple of years before they realize that the conditions have changed. But we want to look at all these things. I will kind of save you tonight from knowing everything about all this, maybe because I don't know it myself either, and focus on two things when I get to the results part of this. One is the biodiversity. Of course, some people would be interested in knowing, maybe not so much the biodiversity as such, but they want to know if, for example, if they love this heather bush. Maybe it doesn't look quite like heather, but that was the intention. So if you like heather or you like a forest, you might want to know if this forest will sustain into the future. So, and that could be another way of addressing the question of biodiversity. So, does the species change? The second question is something I call feedback. And many of you will not know what I'm talking about. So therefore you get this. This is another picture of the world, or the globe. This illustrates the global carbon balance. So if you think back to the first slides I showed you about the photosynthesis, carbon coming from the atmosphere being trapped by biology, by plants, getting stored in the soil or released back into the atmosphere. That is this circulation of carbon from the atmosphere into the biosphere and back up into the atmosphere. That is part of the global carbon balance. So we have a lot of carbon in the soil, in the ocean, in the atmosphere, everywhere, in the plants. And therefore we can also make like a household budget of the carbon. Where is the carbon and how much is circulated? And there are many numbers in this one. I will not quiz you on any of those, but there are three numbers that are particularly interesting in terms of feedback. One is this one. 6.4 of these gigatons of carbon per year being released from fossil fuels up into the atmosphere. That is the carbon you can read about every day in the newspaper, because that is the carbon which comes from oil and coal and which is creating climate change. And this is the amount of carbon, or the amount of carbon getting into the atmosphere. That is the amount of carbon we want to get rid of by making alternative energy sources, so we don't have to take out oil and coal by windmills or biomass or something else. 6.4. Then we have two other numbers over here, 119.6 and 120. This is from vegetation. So every year, the vegetation takes up 120 gigatons of carbon, and they release back 119.6 gigatons of carbon. Why is this interesting? It is interesting because these numbers over here are 20 times bigger than this number. That means that if the climate change we have already started, if that changes the balance between the input and the output of carbon from this plant to the soil and back up into the atmosphere, if that changes 5%, with the release being the one that is increased most, that will be just the same number as we have over here. So maybe by building windmills, we can get rid of those 6.4. But if this is going up by 6.4, we still have a problem. Which means that we need to understand a little bit more what happens over here to the climate change we already initiated in order to know if it's enough to build windmills or we have to do something else. Or whether we don't have to do it at all because this one is actually the uptake increases. And that is what we mean by feedback. So is this plant going to be our friend, or is it going to be our enemy? So every day this plant grows, it takes up CO2 from the atmosphere, getting the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere lower. But the soil is releasing CO2 back. So is the growth of this plant going to be the most affected by climate change, or is it the release processes in the soil? Those are two processes that works all the time. And the strongest one will determine whether the feedback will be positive or negative. Therefore, we are very interested in knowing the overall feedback. And this feedback is dependent on all these processes. So, the design issues. The future will be more CO2, it will be higher temperatures, and it will be different precipitation patterns. But if we are to design a time machine, we need to know how much. And how do we know that? Well, there are different There are different models that can predict the future. So we make predictions. Of course, those predictions depend on how we behave. So if we keep digging out oil and coal, and if we keep being many more people on the earth, and if we all buy 2 cars, etc., then that will be one story. If we all change to bicycles and start eating vegetarian, etc., etc., it'll be another story. So you will have different scenarios depending on how the world is doing. And IPCC has come up with different scenarios, which tells you how warm it's going to be, depending on how much CO2 we release into the atmosphere. And this lower one is if we stayed as we were in 2000, we would be here. And these are different alternatives. And how well are we actually doing? This was in 2000. How well are we doing? Well, not very well actually, because these were the absolute worst case scenarios. But that's another story. I will not come into that now. So, based on these predictions, we get the numbers we need to put into our biological time machine. So how much warmer it's going to be, how is the precipitation going to change, and how much CO2 will we have in the atmosphere. So for 2075, we will have an increase about 50% of CO2. So it'll go up from, when we started the biological time machine, it was 370, 60 something. And now it's more than 380. So just during the course of our experiment, the CO2 has increased. And it's not because of our experiment. And because of this, the temperature will increase by approximately 2 degrees every month, 2 degrees warmer over the year. And the precipitation is a little bit difficult because the amount of precipitation on a year will probably be a little bit the same. We'll get more water in the summer and less, more in the winter and less in the summer. And we will have long drought periods in the summer. So kind of the scenario we have put into our time machine is only focusing on this 1 month drought in the summer. So now we know what to put into our time machine. But there's another factor which we have to think about. More extreme conditions. It's not only going to be warmer and more CO2 and less or more water. It's also going to be more extreme. And this is illustrated by this one. So if this is if you take this as the annual, for example, the annual temperature, if you take 100 years, you'll have, most of the years will be around here, which is the average of Denmark, for example. Then you'll have some years which are colder and some years which are warmer. And these are the years you will think are extremely warm years. Now, if you then increase the temperature by 2 degrees, so you have the average being higher, it also means that the extremes will be more frequent. So you'll have more years where you have these extreme hot conditions. And then somebody will say, wow. I'll come back to this a little bit later, why this may not only be wow. So, now we have the conditions, we have the knobs we have to put on our time machine. CO2, how can we do that? Well, the most obvious one would be to do like they did in Norway some 20 years ago. They built a big greenhouse. Then you can increase the temperature inside, the CO2 inside the greenhouse, and then you can measure the effect on the plants. This has the disadvantage that when you put up a greenhouse, it gets warmer. So, and you only wanted to mess with the CO2, so you have to do some cooling in order to only look at the CO2. So the other systems have come out where you can release CO2 in a ring like this or like this, and you can control the CO2 in open air. So people have invented CO2 time machines. Now we can go CO2 time traveling. Ooh. Sorry. Then we have the temperature. We also want to go temperature time traveling. And again, the same experiment in Norway with this big greenhouse. If you do a greenhouse, you can increase the temperature inside the greenhouse. Great. The problem is that if you do build a greenhouse, you're also changing the light and the wind. So therefore, other people have invented other time machines where they, for example, are using cables in the soil. They are using infrared radiators, like you use if you're having chickens. You can put up an infrared heater to keep them warm. you can do the same as a scientist. Or you can do these passive nighttime warming shields that are doing the same as when you put on a blanket when you're sitting outside in the cold evening. So now we can go temperature time traveling. The last thing is about the precipitation. We can just create some shelters. If we want to have a drought for like a month or 2 months, we can put up a shelter, and thereby we can take away the water and create a drought. If we want to have more water in other parts of the year, we have to collect the water and we can irrigate it. Water is not that difficult. They have done that in agriculture for years. So now we have 3 different approaches. We can now go CO2 time traveling, temperature time traveling, and water time traveling. So, we're done. So Calvin is sure he has built this time machine. But we do have a problem. Or I should say that these time machines, as you can see, have been invented. And they have been in action for like 10 or 20 years, some even more. But we have a problem, because we know that all 3 factors, CO2, temperature, and precipitation, will happen instantaneously. It's not one or the other. It's all 3 at the same time. And we also know that these 3 factors are the essential factors controlling plant growth. Because as you saw from the first graph, CO2 is controlling photosynthesis. We all know that when things get warmer, the biological processes will go faster. Just leave a little milk on your table outside the fridge for a day, you'll see. And you also know that precipitation is important for plant life. So these are all very important factors, and they happen at the same time. And what if 2 plus 2 is not 4? So we may need to have a better time machine than those that are doing one after another. So if we have all 3 factors at the same time, we might be able to figure out this. I've just split it up into above ground processes, so plant growth, and below ground, which would be all the decomposition. If we do them one after the other, so CO2, what will CO2 do to plants? Well, if we have more CO2 in the air, and we know that the plants are using CO2 for photosynthesis, we might figure out that if we put in more CO2, then we will have more photosynthesis. So maybe the plants will grow better. We also know that if we take away the water, the plants will probably grow less. So probably the above ground processes will go down. And so we can go through all these factors, and we can go through all the processes, and we can try to figure out what each of the individual factors will do. But if we now mix them all up, and not only look at the above and below ground, but we want to look at the whole ecosystem, with 3 factors, some things are going up, some things are going down, what is going to be the end effect? Well, we essentially don't know. That is why we have created the biological time machine, which actually looks a little bit different from this cardboard box. So this is the biological time machine. And how does it work? Well, it works the same way as the individual, these individual time machines. So first of all, we have put out, well, maybe I should show you another of my pictures before, this one. So the first thing you do is you put out a ring. Well, in our case, we put out 12 rings, which is our future. Within each of these rings, we will host the future. Then we want to do elevated CO2. So half of these rings are exposed to the CO2 concentration that we know will be in the future, or very likely will be in the future. 510 ppm, which is 50% more. That was the 2075 predictions for Denmark. So half of the rings are now getting 50% more CO2, and we can now measure if there's a difference between the plants are growing in this ring with the plants growing in this ring, then we will know what the CO2 did. That is the same as the time machines you already saw. But we didn't want to do only CO2, we also wanted to do higher temperatures. So we took these screens that you saw, the blankets that you put over the vegetation at night to keep them warm, which should at least potentially increase the temperature by 2 degrees. And we only warm half of each of the 12 rings. So we have now created a time travel with temperature, where in each of these ambient rings, the ones that have the normal CO2 concentration, we can compare the the plants that are being warmed with the plants that are not being warmed. And we also have an experiment over here where we can compare the plants that are being warmed and having higher CO2 with the ones that are only getting CO2. And finally, we wanted to take away water for a month, so we wanted to create a drought, which we do by putting up screens that take away the water in half of the plot, perpendicular to the ones that are getting temperature. So now we have all 8 combinations. So we have the one piece of cake here, which we call ambient. That is the present conditions. This one is only getting drought. This one is getting warming alone. This one is getting the combination. And over here we have the CO2 plus warming, the CO2 plus drought, and the full Monty. So all 8 combinations. And we did it 6 times. Because there's a big variability. If you go out and measure 2 different plants within this area, you're very likely to get very different results. And you could be unhappy that you are measuring the growth of one plant, of a grass in one plot, as opposed to another grass in the grass in the ambient, as opposed to a grass in the full Monty. And maybe you find that this grass is growing more, but maybe there was an animal who had peed on that plant, so that was a reason why it grew better, and not because of the full Monty. So therefore, by doing it 6 times, it should be a very clever animal who could mess up my experiment. So this is our time machine, and it looks like this. So we here have the rings, and over here we have elevated temperature, and in the ring we have elevated CO2, also over here, and then we have a screen that takes away the water, and down here you have a full combination with the warming screen and the drought screen and the ambient plot over here. So it's basically the same as you already see. We've just mixed them. I have to say there, or to state that this is moderate. So we did 2 degrees warming, actually only 1, 510 ppm and 1 month of drought. I'll come back to why I say moderate here. Why is that important? And as it was also stated in the introduction, this is the 2nd largest climate change experiment on the planet. The biggest one being the one we're all part of. Yeah, it looks like this. And you have already seen this. And now we come to some of the results. And I will not show you all these many different results. It'll be boring, even for me. So I will concentrate on the ones that I've already promised you about biodiversity and feedback. So starting with the feedback. These are very busy graphs. I'll take you through them. You don't have to look at all of them. Down here we have in each of them we have 8 bars. And those are the 8 different treatments. So we have ambient, temperature, drought, temperature and drought, CO2, temperature and CO2, drought and CO2, temperature, drought and CO2. So those are the ones. And GEP means gross ecosystem productivity. So that is how much do the plants grow. And the bigger negative numbers, the better they grow. So you can see here that if you compare, the temperature didn't grow better than the ones. So if you increase the temperature, the plants didn't grow more than the plants that were just ambient. But if you droughted them for like a month, they were growing a little bit less, which was probably expected. If you did both temperature and drought, they grew even worse. What I want you to focus on here is if you just compare, all those 4 are the ones that didn't get CO2. And all the 4 over here are the ones that did get CO2. And as you can see, the CO2 ones are growing better than the ambient ones. So CO2 is stimulating plant growth. That was a little bit what we expected because of photosynthesis being stimulated by elevated CO2. So that is the friendly part of the story. The plants are our friends. They take up CO2, and when you give them more CO2, they take up more CO2 from the atmosphere. So that might be that the plants could actually level out the extra CO2, which would be great. Then we have the enemy processes over here. So that is soil respiration. That is the amount of respiration that is released from the soil back into the atmosphere. And you see exactly the same, that the more, here the positive numbers means more. So you can see that the CO2 treated plots are releasing more CO2 into the atmosphere. And if you then, so that means we have some processes that are taking up CO2 and we have some that are releasing CO2. And in both cases, CO2 are stimulating the process, and the net result is that there's no difference. So actually, there's no difference in the feedback to the atmosphere. However, oh, it's down here. So elevated CO2 stimulates uptake. This is all what we call new carbon. That is carbon that was CO2 that was taken up from the atmosphere in the growing season this year. So it's new carbon. The carbon that is released from the soil is a mixture of new and old carbon. By new carbon, I mean carbon that was taken up by the plants from the atmosphere and sent down to the roots and released from the roots immediately. So that is some of the CO2 that you took up will end up in the atmosphere shortly after. So that is new carbon. By old carbon, I mean this might be carbon. If you go out and dig in your garden, you will find all this black stuff, which is old carbon. It could have been there for 10 years, maybe 1,000 years. Some of the CO2 that comes out of the soil is old carbon. And the problem here is that if it's all carbon that is taken up, new carbon that goes in, if it's all going out again, it's not really a problem. Then it's just circulating. But if it's old carbon, that means that we are putting new carbon into the plants, which may be stored there for a while, but we are taking money out of the bank, which we don't like. We don't know yet if that is the case. We're going to kill the biological time machine in June this year. And then we will probably know how much of this is old and how much is new. Hopefully it's not very much old. Because if it's old carbon, then we have a problem that this is not a balance anymore. If it's old carbon, that means that CO2 will actually stimulate the release of old carbon. So the more CO2 you get in the atmosphere, the more CO2 you get released from the soil of old carbon. That means that you'll get more CO2 in the atmosphere. That will stimulate even more CO2 coming out of the soil, which means that you'll get more CO2 in the atmosphere. That will stimulate even more CO2 coming out of the soil. So that is the kind of thing we don't want to have. I can unfortunately not tell you the result yet. The other part I wanted to say something about was what you could call species change or biodiversity. And this is showing two different plant species. So these are the grasses and these are the kaluna bushes, so these small shrubs. And it shows it's over time. And we've just compared here the CO2 under ambient with the CO2 under higher. So the ones to the left are the ambient and the ones to the right are the ones that are getting higher CO2. And you can see that over time, the grasses, there's not very much difference. There is a difference over here. So the kaluna bushes are growing more. But that's nothing to do with our experiment. It's just because we put up a fence so there were no animals to kill the plants, so they grew better. But they grew equally better, both in elevated CO2 and in ambient CO2. So the conclusion is that in this case, the impact on plant species are relatively small. So we actually don't seem, in our experiment, it doesn't seem like we are changing the species composition. Which could be, some people might think that could be a really big problem if we are changing the species composition. That some of the precious, especially in nature, some of the precious nature areas we like, if they disappear. It doesn't seem like that from our experiment. Another lesson is the answer to this question, what if 2 plus 2 is not 4? Of course, the scary part would be that if 2 plus 2 is not 4 but 27, that means that when things are mixed, they just go berserk. We have investigated 45 or 55 different processes in our experiment, and many of them are just not showing any result. Some of them are additive. So here you can see the number of processes that are being additive, synergistic, and antagonistic, and I'll explain what that means. If it's additive, it means that 2 plus 2 is 4. If that is the case, it's very easy, because then we actually don't have to build this very complicated time machine. Then we can just make each of the individual time machines, and then we can add up what the result is going to be. But some of them are, so there are 3 of those. 4 of those are showing synergistic effect. That means that 2 plus 2 is more than 4. It's 7 or 20 or something. And 13 of them are antagonistic. That means that they kill each other. Not necessarily completely, but 2 plus 2 is not 4, but maybe 3 or 2. So they have a lower effect that you would have predicted if you did them individually. That is great, because that means that the more processes you put in, the less effect you get. The net effect will be smaller, which is good, because then you don't have these runaway processes. So that provides a little bit of comfort. And I'll just show you one interesting result over here. As you can see here, the individual factors do actually have an effect, but in many, many cases in our experiment, if we compare the ambient with the full Monty over here, very often they show exactly the same response. So there's very little difference. So those were 3 results, and that actually we are not the only ones that have tested this. So the general impression is that most time machines show relatively moderate impact, and this combination of different factors does not have any runaway problem. But there may be something that we have forgotten, and I have already indicated it earlier, about the extreme events, that in the future the conditions will be more extreme. And maybe the best way I can explain it is by this graph, which is only about water, but you could basically do the same with temperature. And it's also a busy graph, so So here we have the ambient conditions, and over here we have the more extreme conditions. And here we have what we could call Denmark. That's MESIC, or intermediate. As you know, we are a little bit in the middle of the road. Not too outspoken and not too dull either. So we are in the middle of the road. So most of the time, plants in Denmark are having the amount of water they need. So any process in an ecosystem like this would go up and down depending on how much water. So water will stimulate some of the processes, and so if you get more water, it gets better, and if you get less water, it gets worse. And of course, if you look over the years, this could be the time. It could be a growing season. It could also be over years. So then you get a precipitation event. So the water gets up, and then it doesn't rain for a while, and the water gets down, etc. It goes up and down. Then sometimes it gets really dry, or it gets really wet. And for all processes, there is typically what we call a threshold. If it gets too dry, the lawn wilts. You come home from your holiday, it hasn't rained for a month, and your lawn is completely yellow. So sometimes it gets so dry that the plants will die, or some of the processes just doesn't work. It can also get too wet. If you soak your lawn with 2 years of precipitation and let it stay there for months, then the plants will drown, or the plants in your window doesn't like too much water either. So you can get into what you call anoxia, so it gets too little oxygen. So most processes will have both upper and lower limits. And that is actually the same. Xeric means very dry systems, like in a desert. Hydric means very wet systems. They basically have the same. So if you take the same process, the optimal area is still up here, but in a xeric, in a dry system, most of the time you will be outside that window where the plants are growing well. If you go to a very wet system, most of the time the system will be so wet that they don't grow either. But eventually, even in a dry system, you get one rain event where you get into the area where plants are comfortable and they start growing. It may only take a few weeks, and then you're back into nothing. So that's the way all systems work. If you now go into a situation where you are basically getting the same amount of water, we can take Denmark, so we get the same amount of water in the future, but it doesn't come the same way anymore. Now instead of having rain every second day, we have a lot more rain, but it only comes, the rain events are much, much bigger, but they only come every second week. That means that the fluctuation now will go up and down. And what you can see here is that sometimes or more often we will get out of this comfort zone. Have more situations where we have long-term droughts and also situations where it gets more wet. And it's exactly the same in a wet system and in a dry system. This is important because the kind of ecosystem experiment I was doing or presenting you before was only a moderate. We were doing this. And that means that the window we are looking into, the window that the scientists have been looking into when it comes to climate change experiments, is this window. So we forgot about the most extreme parts. In many cases we did. So we don't know very much about what happens here. And that could actually be the situation which is the most important. That could be actually the time when things are really changing. The year we have this, where our time machine is, we have a mixture of these grasses and kaluna bushes. And maybe it's a very sustained ecosystem. It may be very robust to the changes. Until 1 year, when it gets so dry that either the grasses or the kaluna bushes are killed. And then you might have a complete change. And we don't know very much about that because the time machines haven't been very good in capturing this. And one of the reasons, it's not because we are stupid. Well, maybe we are, but when we were designing this experiment, it cost a fortune to build such a time machine. And one of the questions, or one of the things we are asking ourselves when you're talking about climate change will work over many, many years. So you need to have what we call long-term experiments. We don't want to do just 1 year and then we think if we know what happened in 1 year, then we'll know what happened in 50 years. So we want to run it for like 5 or 10 years. So one of the things we said to ourselves in the beginning is that we want to keep the system running for 10 years. So therefore we should stop the drought before we kill the plants. So we have on purpose designed our machine to not be too dramatic. So actually we know very little about these extreme events, which may actually be some of the more important ones. So most of the knowledge we have about extremes are from what we call empirical evidence. So that is when you have 1 year where it gets really dry, but it wasn't an experiment. So we have very few experiments to test it. So if I should sum up my talk, we still have a little bit of an open question about the feedback. There are some indications that maybe we are harvesting old carbon when we increase the CO2 in the atmosphere, which would be a sad story to tell if that's true. The species composition seems to be relatively robust, at least in moderate changes. And multi-factor climate change rarely causes runaway, again, when we're doing these moderate experiments. So most of this is actually kind of comforting. It doesn't point to any dramatic changes. But also, another take-home message is that we need some new time machines or some new time machine designers. So if any of you are students or want to be, we need you to help us build the next generation of time machines that can deal with extreme events. So, Calvin and Hobbes, to finish, they are a goldmine of wonderful stories about how we are as human beings. And by that, I want to say thanks for your attention.
All right, thank you, Klaus. There is time for a few questions if anybody from the audience wants to ask. Yep.